Welcome to the World War I podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore a wide range of interesting topics related to World War I. This podcast is sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. We often talk about the First World War as a global event that had a tremendous impact on everything. But how did the nations, organizations, and people involved in the war actually frame or understand the conflict they were fighting? That's the question at the heart of Framing the First World War: How Divergent Views Shaped a Global Conflict, a recently published collection of essays that draws on diverse fields and methods to shed just a little more light on a war that remains incompletely understood. To discuss some of these frames of understanding, today the World War I podcast is hosting the editors of Framing the First World War, Dr. Michael Finch, Dr. Aimée Fox, and Dr. David Morgan-Owen. Welcome, and thank you all for being here.
Thanks for having us, Amanda.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed reading the essays. There were so many interesting topics, and I recognized several of the authors from past episodes of the World War I podcast and other programs we've done. And so I guess I want to start off with asking, how did this collection come together, and where did that idea come from?
I suppose maybe the honest answer is that there was quite a lot of disruption happening in the world at the time. We were kind of in pandemic kind of lockdowns, and there was a lot of uncertainty. So I think we were looking for a project that we might be able to engage in, just to give us a bit of focus of something to kind of do. And we were hoping that there might be other people that were in a similar kind of space to ourselves that might be maybe disrupted from things that were normally going on, and maybe willing to put a little bit of time to doing something collaborative together. So that was maybe kind of like our starting point. In terms of intellectually then what we were sort of seeking to do, I guess in certain respects, maybe our thinking was a bit informed by the experience of the centenary of the First World War and kind of that coming to an end, and maybe thinking kind of where next for First World War studies. Like the period between 2014 and 2018, there was just such a kind of flourishing, obviously, of people engaging with the First World War in all sorts of new ways, but also just amazing scholarship and long-term developments in the field kind of coming to fruition and being communicated to wider audiences in a new way. And I guess an awful lot of that was really bearing the fruit of what historians often refer to as like the cultural turn in First World War studies, which has kind of been one of the defining trends in the field, particularly of the kind of European history of the First World War over the last several decades, that many of your listeners are doubtless kind of familiar with. And as a kind of an important moment for us was an essay that John Horn, who's obviously a prominent figure in the cultural turn, wrote in the journal Past and Present, in which he questioned, is this the end of the paradigm of the cultural turn? Has the cultural turn kind of run out, or what might be happening next? And in that, he observed that the cultural history of the First World War continued to operate in what he called a semi-parallel universe from what he saw, on the other hand, as the causal history of the First World War, how things happened, how they influenced each other, in what order, those kinds of big moving parts. And I guess that kind of provocation gave us some food for thought about how and why and in what kind of areas we might be able to mobilize ideas, scholarship, the really profound influence of the cultural turn in ways that maybe reconnected it in different ways to the military history of the First World War. And that kind of arrived us at some of these ideas around like framing, understanding, and assumptions. So, this is an area where a body of work like the First World War historiography is rich already. Like, I'm sure many listeners will be familiar with the idea of James Joel's kind of unspoken assumptions. We're definitely not the first people to come to the conclusion that thinking about how people may have perceived the world around them is a very relevant thing to study. But I guess Joel's kind of classic essay about lecture and then essay on the unspoken assumptions really focuses in upon the minds of kind of the political leaders and the origins of the First World War. And I suppose what we were maybe looking to do was orientate that more specifically to various people within the kind of military world that were actually holding responsibility for directing aspects of what might have been happening in the First World War.
Well, I think also all of us kind of shared a broader interest in trying to understand ideas in relation to the war and trying to get into some areas to do with how, well, not just the war, but to some extent ideas about war are understood. So I think some of this project also responds to the challenges of trying to do that in a more substantiated fashion. This is all very well to sort of make some of these claims, but how do you actually turn something into things where there's actually more evidence to back things up? How do you start to think methodologically about some of these things? And what kind of avenues can you pursue via the various different contributions to the book? Because I mean, many of them go in very different directions from each other.
Now, before we discuss your own chapters, I'd love to hear each of you spotlight maybe one or two essays from another contributor that really stood out to you and why the topic grabbed your attention. Because as you mentioned, you cover a lot of ground, a lot of different topics, a lot of different perspectives. So if we could just go around and you share some of those.
Yeah, I'm happy to go. So I have a really long interest in military organizations and in notions of change as well. So the two chapters I think I was most excited about, although there were so many to be enthused about, were Alexander Watson's chapter on tactical innovation in the Habsburg army, and also Sofia Anasimova's chapter on learning in the Imperial Russian army. And I think these two chapters are wonderful for so many reasons. But first, I think what's really powerful about them is that they actually offer us different or alternative case studies on military learning. And as many of your listeners will know, when we think about learning in the context of the First World War, we really are talking about the British and the German militaries in the First World War. And parts of that scholarship are very much tied to notions of like victory and effectiveness as well. And so when we think about the Habsburg army and the Imperial Russian army, they do not frequently feature as successful learning organizations, right? If we're going to use that business terminology there. But I think what both Alex and Sophia's chapters reveal is that these two organizations that have been seen as quite ineffective are capable of very high levels of learning and adaptation. So I think there's that first point there, that these are just very interesting, different ways of thinking about learning. And I suppose, secondly, I was really struck by some of the commonalities that came out, and that also I could see in my own work on learning in the British Army in the First World War, particularly around ideas like emulation and inter-organizational learning. So in Alex's chapter, for instance, what I found really powerful was the role that German military doctrine played in the shaping of tactical innovation in the Habsburg army, particularly like the importing of German stormtroop tactics, for instance, that the Austro-Hungarians end up using. But what's interesting here is context, right? Is that the Habsburgs use stormtroop tactics, and these are rendered quite ineffective in the Piave offensive in 1918 because the British troops they've come up against have seen these tactics before and have undergone their own learning and adaptation process. And I think we see that emulation also occurring in Sophia's chapter, right, with Russian and French knowledge exchange. So there's interesting things here around national prestige. What does it mean if you're importing best practice from an ally? What does that mean for you and your own military identity? But again, some of those challenges of what are the implications of importing best practice from a completely different operational theatre, a completely different environment to the Eastern Front? Like, how do you make sense of that? So there was so much in those chapters that really resonated with my own work, and I think just highlights the power of those comparative transnational approaches. So yeah, very excited about those.
I had a couple as well. So one of them is Vander Wilcox's chapter on the Italian volte-face after the beginning of the First World War through to the spring of 1915. And I find that the chapter is very interesting because it really tries to engage in depth with the military aspects of what that period actually meant. And one of the things that Vander points out is that there has been a heavier emphasis on the political aspects of that and less focus on the military implications of Italy not joining the Triple Alliance and fighting against the Entente at the very beginning of the war and then ending up on the complete other side to it. And so really it allows for an exploration that does a couple of things. It lets Vanya analyze what actually happens during that period in terms of that is an opportunity. And actually, a lot of this is kind of similar to some of the stuff Amy's talking about in Sophia and Alex's chapter. That 8-month period becomes a period during which, in theory, they have the luxury of observing the war in practice before they then actually join it. So if that is the case, why is it that things are not, they're not able to take advantage of it when they actually do join hostilities? And actually, Vander's kind of putting the challenge back in some of that and putting the complications back into it as well, in order to show the way that some of it is to do with, well, you have all of these experiences, but how do you transfer them from places like the Western Front to the place where the Italians actually end up fighting, which in terms of terrain and all those kind of things is very, very different from the Western Front. But the other thing that's interesting with that as well is it also is about the recalibration mentally of going from a place where you were preparing to fight alongside the people that you end up fighting against, and you end up fighting with the people you was supposed to be fighting against in the first place, which is quite it's a big sort of mental shift for any military organization to have to go through, especially if it has done pre-war military planning based on particular scenarios. And then within this as well, there's this sort of fairly extraordinary development whereby the head of the Italian army, who's called Alberto Polio, actually dies on the 1st of July 1914 and is replaced only at that point by Luigi Cadorna. So there's all this kind of things going on that give a tremendous sort of insight into the complexities of that kind of shift. And the other chapter that I was going to highlight as well is Sneha Reddy's chapter on networks of resistance in North Africa and India, which is a chapter that she develops in as something that can be understood in reaction, in particular, to the Ottoman participation in the war, and what that actually means for imperial subjects in those empires, particularly in North Africa and in India. It's a lens through which she develops an analysis that seeks to transcend some of the national bloc style thinking about empires, and instead to try and push towards a more transnational picture, to push towards something that embraces broader identities amongst imperial populations, as well as religious aspects as well. So trying to cut across those sort of national bloc lines and really grappling again with the complexities of what that actually means during the war itself. So she develops this analysis with regard to 3 different kind of categories of resistance networks: the nationalist ones, the pan-Islamic movement, and also the communist networks. All the while having to grapple with the fact that this is also an area in which you're dealing with competing historical narratives, if you like. So you have the narrative of the war on the one hand, in which some of this stuff in which it fits, in which it can be understood. And in fact, obviously, the ways in which the war itself is helping to shape and influence some of this stuff. But there's also a much longer historical narrative at play as well, which precedes what's going on during the war itself, and which runs long afterwards, because the sort of bigger story of imperial resistance, if it's part of a narrative that leads eventually to independence, is a much longer one. So it's a really sort of challenging thing to try to do.
Yeah, so I guess in addition to those, we were just incredibly lucky with the colleagues and collaborators who we were able to work with in this project, and we really value all of their contributions. And it was great to work with them. I suppose to select two, I think one that chimes quite a lot with some of the themes that Aimée and Mike have already introduced is Mark Grolich and up and coming scholar Brian Lynn's chapter on the US Army, which kind of whereas Vander's looking over the kind of 8-month period where before Italian belligerence, Brian and Mark look at the kind of almost 3-year period prior to US entry into the war. And I think two things really jumped out at me about that, which was kind of firstly the extent of the kind of bureaucratic, political and personal barriers that all act as brakes on change within an army, even if that army is actually in part quite clear-sighted about why learning change, new forms of doing things might be quite necessary. So the kind of the juxtapose between some of the quality of the observations that are being fed back into the US Army system, but the resistance or the inability or the blockages to be able to make something happen about that, I thought was really, really interesting. And they're quite critical of Pershing in particular in that respect, which is an interesting argument. I think that the kind of second part about it is just the extent of the US military weakness prior to 1917 that they bring out, which is, I think, perhaps slightly lost or underplayed sometimes in accounts of the European war that are very interested or concerned with the idea of the United States potentially forcing some kind of compromise peace upon the fighting European powers, maybe in 1916 or towards the end of that year. It was really interesting just how, disruptive operations against Mexico in 1916 were to the organization of the US Army and its preparation for a European war, which was, I think, very elegantly done and really interesting. I think the second one I'd highlight would be the chapter from Louis Hailwood about cooperation amongst Allied navies during the conflict, particularly in the Mediterranean, which is an area that's maybe slightly more peripheral in some mainstream accounts, despite some excellent scholarship there by people like Paul Halpern. And I think what really jumped out at me from Louis' chapter is the way in which naval officers of various countries were really proactively theorizing about the post-war world. They were thinking about what is the meaning that we can take forward from this experience. And it kind of highlights the porosity of barriers between this kind of military world of, expertise and professionalism, and these kind of wider vistas that are being shaped and in turn reacting with how the military are actually seeing aspects of the war. These were individuals that had politics and they had ideas about different forms of internationalism, of diplomacy, of ways of organizing the world that might potentially result in a more peaceful future. And it's actually surprising how kind of little we really know about what the politics of soldiers were in those respects. In this case, Louis is talking a lot more about sailors, about whom we know even less. So that chapter really jumped out at me as being a really valuable contribution.
It is an incredibly diverse collection. And when I thought of that question, I thought, gosh, I would really struggle to answer this, but I think you all did a very good job. Dr. Fox, your essay, Between You and Me and the Bedpost, Gossip and the Social Life of the British Armed Forces in the First World War, makes a very good case for gossip as a useful analytical tool for historians. Tell us how you define gossip and why is it such a useful frame?
Thanks, Amanda. That's a really great question. And it took me a long time to really settle. And I still don't know if I'm totally settled on my definition of gossip. And I think because in some ways gossip is it when you see it, when you're participating in it, right? But it is actually really difficult to pin down what it is. How is it different to conversation with another person? So I think for me, I define gossip as fundamentally a language of intimacy, right? It is always personal and it usually involves some kind of judgmental or evaluative talk about another person who's usually not present when it's happening. And I think it's that intimacy that differentiates gossip from, related but quite separate notions such as hearsay and rumor, where there is a sort of anonymity attached to that. So what I would say about gossip in terms of its usefulness or utility as a frame, is to try and sort of like situate this outside the discipline of history. So organizational studies scholars have gone a long way to researching the power of gossip. So they would acknowledge gossip as, a form of sense making. Well, that's making sense of the organization that you work in, understanding it. They see it as a form of learning, whether that's learning the ropes, learning who holds power in organizations, but also where that power sits. So we think about secretaries, personal assistants, executive assistants who have access to information and may be able to trade that via gossip. So I feel like I drew a lot of inspiration from other disciplines and kind of try to bring that into the historical realm. So why I think gossip's a useful frame, I think about gossip as almost providing a useful reframing tool, as it were. And I think that gossip helps us reframe three different things. The first is how we think about military knowledge itself, as in like what counts when we talk about military knowledge, and why haven't scholars taken gossip seriously as a form of knowledge, as a form of oral tradition. Because I feel like if we start including that in our schemata of knowledge, then that actually opens up quite exciting new ways of problematizing, not just military, but military knowledge. I also think that it helps us reframe, the very nature of the military organization. And I think about that in terms of like its borders as an organization or its boundaries. But I think it also draws attention to like the ungoverned or the unmanaged spaces within an organization. And what I mean by that is, the kind of corridors, the little alcoves that people are having those conversations in. This is rendered a little bit more visible to us, that sits behind the wiring diagrams of, who's serving under who at various points. But the fact that it troubles those boundaries, I find absolutely fascinating. So it enables knowledge to move in and out of the organization. And I think that's exciting to me, because gossip then almost challenges the seeming rationality and the organization of these highly bureaucratic and hierarchical organizations. And the final way I think that engages in reframing is the notion of power itself. So gossip is very much a tool of surveillance. It's a tool of control. It offers power over people, but it also offers power to people as well. And I think this power over people manifests in terms of the regulation of social norms and behaviors. When officers are straying too far from accepted social norms, gossip can be used as a way of bringing them down or cutting them down to size. But I think my final point here is, gossip has traditionally been seen as like a weapon of the weak, that people or individuals who are marginalized by dominant society can actually use gossip as a way of subverting that or contesting those dominant societies and identities. So even though it's been trivialized, it still, I think, has real potential as an analytical tool, but also just as a way of problematizing, quite traditional notions of power as well.
I was just looking for my notes because you had a really wonderful quote in there about the corridors of power, and I cannot find my notes. You don't happen to remember that, do you?
Yeah, so it's something about like the corridors of power and the power of corridors. I think.
Yes, that was it.
Yeah.
No, I thought that was great.
Yeah, no, I think that is exactly what it does, right? It's the spatial quality, but also the intimacy that's at play in the spaces of the military organization.
Now, I think you've already answered in some ways my next question, but it's clear that gossip was very widespread in the British military, in just general life. Why do you think historians have mostly overlooked it or just been hesitant to treat it as a legitimate source for understanding the First World War?
Yeah, I think there's a I think there's a couple of points here. One, I'm sort of reluctant to use this word, but I'm going to use it anyway. I think there's a slight snobbery around gossip, because when we think about gossip, it's something you do in your free time. It's this kind of like idle chat, right? That it doesn't have any real worth as such. So the fact that it's been rendered unimportant or idle, but also the way that it's coded. So it is a highly feminine coded practice. You know, it's frequently like referred to as like women's talk, even though men gossip just as much as women, and military officers gossip a lot, as it turns out. But I think the fact that it has been trivialized or dismissed is also because it's not seen as having the authority or the weight of a document that's maybe been typed or written. So there's something really interesting here about notions of authority, you know, that the written word has greater authority than this kind of oral tradition as such. And I think that leads to my second point, is that gossip is really hard to find. You know, this is not designed to be written down. This is something that can be denied. So actually trying to find it, particularly in an archive, requires you to pay attention to different signifiers or turns of phrase. So the title of the paper, for example, between you and me and the bedpost was a particular signifier that this officer would use when, you know, gossiping to his wife. So you start having to pay attention to those phrases, but also you start reading against the grain of sources and trying to find these instances of gossip. But I also think maybe it's not been as foregrounded is because it is highly intimate. And it's often found in letters between intimates, whether that is husbands and wives, you know, husbands and other men's wives, you know, friends, etc. And those collections are not always accessioned, right? So there is again another point here about privileging and hierarchy around what is deemed important in archival collections. So I would say that it does exist, but it is like finding a needle in a haystack. So when I find that needle, I'm very excited about it. But it is definitely worthwhile, I think.
Do you think this gossip frame applies beyond the British forces in the First World War, say cross-culturally or even in other eras of warfare?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this, you know, unsurprisingly has a really long history. I think it can certainly apply beyond the British context and beyond the First World War context as well. I'm sure David won't mind me saying, you know, the three of us used to work in British military education and working with military officers and hearing the gossip kind of swirling around military organizations even to this day, you know, shows that this is not going anywhere. I think the medium through which that gossip is exchanged, whether that is through, you know, WhatsApp, kind of things like that, I think it's quite interesting to see how that shifts over time. As I say, you know, organizational studies scholars have done so much of this good work for us in terms of, you know, quite detailed field work and ethnography in order to really highlight the importance of gossip as a form of managing emotions and relationships. So I'm very keen to explore this beyond the context of the First World War and hopefully cross-culturally. So I guess it's a kind of watch this space moment.
Absolutely. Dr. Finch and Dr. Morgan-Owen, your co-authored chapter, Strategy, War, and Empire, The Entanglements of Anglo-French Military Thinking in the Pre-War Era, challenges the usual view of Britain and France as uneasy allies with very different strategic visions. In a global world, is the very act of formulating strategic ideas an inherently collaborative act? Is that the argument?
I was thinking about the terminology of this, and I'm not sure. I mean, I suppose on one level you could make that argument, but I wonder about the word collaborative, because I think that some of what we're doing could best be described as sort of involuntary collaborative in some senses. And actually, maybe it's more that stuff is inherently interactive. I think that this chapter in particular is a sort of a forum in which me and Dave are sort of clashing together our respective specializations and trying to put it into a sort of useful understanding. So actually, I in some ways, it's us also trying to work out what we think about things. You know, my background is more has been more French and land-based, and Dave's has been more British and naval-based. But we've been in dialogue about a lot of things for quite a long time now, and talking about this stuff makes you realize the ways in which actually interactivity, and in this case there is an element, obviously, because you're talking about people who obviously end up eventually aligned to each other. There is a collaborative aspect to it, but a lot of what we're trying to do is, it's kind of similar to, again, some of the things that Aimée was saying, in the sense that, like, it's trying to say, yes, we acknowledge that the sort of some of the classic tropes about rivalry and difference are not invalid, but also there is a way that you can investigate some of the actual nuances of interactivity and collaboration between former rivals who become allies. I think that's kind of the way that I would pitch that one.
I think in certain respects we were trying to make sense of the kind of interplay between two things that are both kind of true at the same time. On the one hand, there are kind of cosmopolitan aspects to strategy. There are interactions of different kinds, sometimes personal, in person, correspondence, reading each other's work, maybe being in similar kind of imperial spheres, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, there is a very strong national dimension to this as well. Like, many people that are concerned to think about strategy in this period do so quite explicitly in the context of the nation. Even if they are actually writing in the context of an empire, they will use a word like Britain or Germany or France to describe it. And I suppose what we were trying to do is trying to make sense of that in certain respects. And I think a core part of what we were trying to get over was that even though they're writing in different contexts, many of them are actually grappling with trends or problems that are inherently transnational and common to them. So even if they are writing from sites that are distinct, if maybe not all that distinct, they are actually dealing with things that share quite a lot of commonality. This kind of idea of like co-imperialism, basically. So whether that's trends like, what does the introduction of the telegraph mean for how you orientate and organize power in the context of an empire? This is a common problem for different people to deal with. And so they're kind of trying to make sense of this in different ways. And so, I guess we're trying to make sense of how to kind of move beyond a very national frame, but in this wider kind of interactive context that then, as Mike says, kind of sets the scene maybe for some very gradual, halting, sometimes quite pained steps towards greater collaboration during the war itself.
And I think I'm going to sort of steal a little bit of Dave's thunder, because Dave can talk about this in much greater detail with regard to his own research. But also, there's a part of this as well which is interesting for us, because engaging with stuff in this way is a kind of battle against earlier periods of sense making, if you like. So that, and it intersects with some of this national frameworks and national ideas stuff, that the power of ideas that were promulgated immediately after the First World War, that are made with knowledge of what the outcome of the war is and what actually happened, actually have a really powerful effect on subsequent understanding of how belligerents went into the war, understanding certain things, in particular, understanding things like strategy in particular. And actually, which is a sort of slightly more complicated way of saying that it's a framework that allows us to, once engaged with, get into trying to really understand the ideas as they existed before outcomes were known. So again, it's about sort of playing history forward, but doing it in the realm of ideas and understanding, which, as it turns out, it's a very, very hard thing to do, because recovering some of these things is not necessarily straightforward when you have a weight of stuff after the First World War. Like, we make a lot of reference to Little Heart at the beginning of this, where you've got in sort of intellectual terms, you have a particular set of ideas and a particular historical narrative forming after the First World War, which is all about seeing things on national lines in terms of the difference between, the continentalists and this emerging British way of warfare idea.
What are some examples of the entanglement that you were referring to, and what role did imperial behaviors play in facilitating this exchange?
So I think maybe on the theme of dealing with similar kind of sets of problems or challenges. I think in both contexts, people are trying to actually grapple with a dawning realization that something about the changing nature of empire itself was actually impacting how they needed to think about strategy, and kind of vice versa. So there's a quote that we used in the chapter from a French naval officer who makes the observation that he's writing historically here. Until the empire, strategy seems to have chiefly had in view to equalize forces as much as possible on each field of battle. So until something called empire, strategy was about fighting battles. And he then carries on to say it's therefore necessary to look at things from a higher point of view. Totally different conclusions are then arrived at. So he's kind of trying to make sense there in a quite a sort of halting way that you see repeated in various ways in the British context, about the fact that the geopolitical, geostrategic challenge of empire necessitates new ways of thinking about what this word called strategy needs to do. And I think that that kind of search for new forms of logic to understand the kind of security puzzle that is being posed in these distinct but related imperial contexts is kind of quite a sort of pervasive theme that works differently in some of the different contexts. Did you want to maybe add something related to the Cornwell stuff, Mike?
Yeah, I suppose one of the things about the imperial element of this is it's actually, and maybe even sort of counterintuitively, one of the areas in which you can grasp some things with a little bit more substance, because actually there is a literature that exists in the study of imperialism, European empires in particular, at the turn of the century and the beginning of the 20th century, which does stress the interactivity and the interdependence of imperial projects. But it tends to focus less on the military aspect, which on one level is kind of understanding, because I guess that is the natural place where you would say, well, this is actually where you would think that some of the that some of the interactivity would end, because this stuff is essentially founded on rivalry. And of course, there's this powerful and long-standing idea about imperial rivalry as being something that plays into the very cause of the war itself, however disputed that is. But actually, there's lots of different ways in which you can glimpse a certain sense of interactivity or sharing of ideas well before the war actually starts. So, in particular, you can trace some of the sort of the international aspects of even parts of colonial or imperial military thought, and you can do it actually through documents and through publication. If you particularly look at, so one of the things we talk about is the way that if you look at Cornwell's Small Wars, which is the sort of British textbook for imperial conflict, and if you look at its nearest French equivalent, which is a book called Alfred Dietz's Observations sur la guerre dans les colonies, that there is actually reference within those books to the other's imperial experience. And actually, we know as well, because Alexander Morrison in particular has developed this, that there's a big Russian aspect to Cornwell's book too. So some of this stuff is kind of going on, and I've also done some work prior to this about Hubert Lyautey and some of the things that Hubert Lyautey was doing after the war. So you can also see the ways in which some of the things that we're talking about tie people together across national lines, because there's a way in which the imperial endeavor actually transcends that, and that actually there is a shared notion of people being part of something that is, it's a sort of entity in its own right. And I suppose the other thing to add with this as well is that once you get into the detail of some of this, it shouldn't surprise us too much to see that there is this kind of interactivity on the military score as well as on the sort of civilian sphere of imperialism, because actually the imperial aspects, they don't conform very well to the sort of boundary between peace activity and war activity. They actually break some of those boundaries down. And then also it sort of rebounds back into some of the stuff that Dave was talking about, whereby the other thing that you can see here is that that imperial is becoming, or the imperial element or the imperial idea is becoming ever more enmeshed with bigger ideas about strategy that are taking shape in this period. So to really understand the full dimensions of strategy, you have to, even though it's not necessarily articulated in this way at this time, you have to think about it as being something that includes the imperial elements too.
Well, I think you sort of answered the next question. Does this help us understand other imperial powers in the war? Or even, as I asked Dr. Fox earlier, does it help us understand this across kind of time and space?
I mean, I would hope that some of it does, like, provide food for thought for people. But, like one of this, in theory, a lot of this stuff you would say, well, absolutely, there's no inherent reason why. The challenges are often to do with, obviously, the different contexts for different, different imperial powers, if you're talking about this in First World War terms, but also the challenges of doing the history. We are, as ever, sort of restrained by source access, the languages that we speak. I mean, a lot of it is actually, it makes a very good case. Whether you're talking about this stuff or you're talking about Amy's research into gossip, it makes very good cases for collaborative project work involving people with multiple talents and nationalities and linguistic abilities.
I guess I would see some of the themes as maybe being actually reflected in other places in the book, particularly in the sense of how strategy gets kind of pulled in two different directions or two sets of directions when you're making war in the context of an empire. On the one hand, there is an obvious external orientation concerned with kind of maximizing imperial effort against another policy, an adversary of some kind. But on the other, strategy is a tool of imperial control and repression. And in the context of a major war, the interaction between these two is actually the defining challenge that something called strategy is kind of burdened with trying to solve. Because on the one hand, any kind of major internal disturbance is rendered simultaneously more likely due to the extractive practices of imperialism that might be making life significantly more difficult than it already is from people living within imperial contexts. But yet any kind of disturbance that requires the deployment of military force is even more damaging than it otherwise would be, because it might pose a threat to the overall war effort as a whole. So there's this kind of like balancing that's going on. And we see this reflected in a number of the chapters. I think obviously Mike's already mentioned Snare's chapter that sees this from the perspective of resistance and that sees the other side of the coin, which is a really valuable perspective to add. But also, Brian and Mark introduce the impact of kind of US expeditions against Mexico, the continued burden of garrisoning the Philippines as factors in thinking of the US Army. But we might maybe add to this things like Alexander Morrison's work on the Central Asian revolts of 1916, where Russia in its imperial context is very much fighting wars of colonial pacification at the same time as actually pursuing this larger geopolitical project of the war itself. And so the imbrications between these things, I think, are really valuable, interesting, and I think quite transferable.
Did any of you have that classic aha moment after the book was published and you thought of something that you wished you had included, or if you could add a frame, what would it be?
I have these thoughts often. I think that like kind of the further you went with this, you could almost have produced a sort of wiki and just carried on adding. Fortunately, our wonderful editor Joyce Harrison and the series editor Bill Allison were extremely strict in terms of giving us, valuable guidance about the parameters of the book and how many chapters we could fit in there. But I think something that I've been re-engaging with recently that made me think this could have been a valuable inclusion was some of the work that the great economic historian Avner Offer did in relation to applying ideas of rationality that are derived from economics to trying to understand aspects of the First World War, particularly connection to the German U-boat campaign and the way in which he kind of explores concepts of like bounded rationality in that context. I think the actual focus on how people were making decisions and what that actually reveals would have been a valuable inclusion, which might have potentially linked to some of the great work that's been done on First World War intelligence studies as well, which for me could have been a valuable addition. What about you two?
For me, it would be more emotions and possibly more family as well. So like I talk in my own chapter about like like effect, and I suppose what you might call like the effective turn, which you could locate within the broader cultural turn in First World War studies. And so when I was writing my own chapter and thinking about sort of like broader research projects, like work by Justin Fantalzo on, you know, the role that the death of General Sir Edmund Allenby's only son had on his like later life pacifism was was a really affecting read. But also David Munger's sort of early work on General Sir Henry Horne, so a British Army general in the First World War, like talking about the impact of his kind of emotional world. So I hinted at it, but it occurred to me that family is such an important frame. And as I say, hinted at it, would love to have explored that further. You know, what war can tell us about family, but also what family or familial interactions can reveal to us about how people understood and made sense of the war that they were fighting. So, you know, these aren't necessarily, you know, revelatory lines of inquiry, but yeah, it's quite easy to overlook, I think.
I just one of the things that always sort of causes me a bit of anxiety when we're dealing with this kind of projects is, you know, whenever you're trying to do something that's really trying to embrace the massive scope of the First World War, there's a part of this where you think, you know, geographically, are there things that we could have included here as well if we had a few more chapters? So, for example, you know, we have, I think we have developed a reasonable imperial lens, you know, seeing the war as a war of empires and bringing some of that to play. But obviously there are ways in which it would be great to have, you know, a Southeast Asia element to this as well. You know, we have this emphasis on the Maghreb in particular, and, you know, we've developed things to do with the Ottoman Empire. But yeah, one of the areas that would be fascinating, I think, is thinking particularly about parts of the French Empire in Southeast Asia. And then potentially also Australia, because I am in Australia, but it's not as big an element of this book.
Those are all very interesting. I think just because I'm at the MacArthur Memorial and we do so much Second World War Pacific theater, I was thinking of Japan. It's a wonderful book, regardless. But these are really, maybe there'll be a volume 2 of additional essays. So before we end, are there any other final thoughts?
I guess maybe to try and take us back to kind of where we started. I guess what we were trying to engage with was that kind of challenge of whether we've reached like the end of a paradigm in terms of this like cultural dominant turn in understanding the conflict. And I think that the answer that Horne offers in his essay is that the cultural history of the First World War is increasingly just become kind of imbricated and baked in lots of innovative, profitable ways to all of the other aspects of the First World War, and that's going to define the kind of next phase of the scholarship. And I think that the really wonderful experiences we had working with different people on so many different diverse aspects of the war makes that, you know, really hard to argue with. I hope what we've kind of added to, and our contributors and collaborators have added to, is that the armed forces themselves, what Horne refers to as maybe some of the more causal aspects of the war, are actually incredibly rich sites for cultural, social, political study, which might have been shied away from by the kind of cultural turn's emphasis on history from below, or the experience of like rank and file soldiers in particular. And so I guess we kind of hope that this book is a contribution to a conversation that we would like to see continue, and highlight some of the, you know, possibilities for more work in future. So yeah, I think that's where we ended up.
That's a good last word.
Yeah. No, I was gonna say I can't beat it. I think that was a great way to finish. So yeah.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Finch, Dr. Fox, Dr. Morgan-Owen. And again, the book is Framing the First World War: How Divergent Views Shaped a Global Conflict. We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov, Or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.